This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. I'm really excited to have y'all for this episode. Normally I would say haere to any episode, but if you're tuning into this one, I would recommend listening to the episode before this, because we are picking up where we left off and diving deeper into critical race theory. Because you know what, there was so much to say the last time, I couldn't fit it into a juicy 54 minutes, so I said let's go round two again, let's get into another 54 minutes, because there's just a lot to say. But you know what though, I get what it's like. Time is precious. If you really want to get into this episode, I'll give you a little bit of scaffolding to work with, and just a quick little recap as to what critical race theory is. But the meat of this conversation is really going to be talking about, how does critical race theory relate to where our feet are at the moment, which is here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And, we're going to talk about, how it relates in 2026. What does it look like? But you know what? Let me give you the short of it first. What were the things that we really got into last time that will give you just a little bit of something to hold on to? And you know what? Even if you did listen to last episode, it's always good to have a little reminder, because I don't know about y'all, but my brain is like a sieve. Because one key misconception about the critical race theory is that it's anything to do with race, and that's not quite it. So it was a framework developed in the 1970s and 1980s by a group of American scholars who were kind of sitting with this truth, or multiple truths, which was, quote unquote formal equality had arrived. The laws had changed in terms of the segregation in America, but that profound racial inequality hadn't. And so the first one is that racism is structural, and it can be personal, but it's structural. It lives in systems and institutions. You don't need a racist intent to produce racist outcomes. Also, critical race theory really kind of highlights that race is not a biological structure, it is a social structure that the concept of race, we as humans have come up with this. Another key idea is that racial progress tends to happen when it happens to align with the interests of the dominant group. And so what that means is that when it's fragile, it can be rolled back to when those interests shift. And we have seen that in real time, I would say in the past 3 to 5 years. The third key idea that came from the critical race theory is the concept of intersectionality, and that we as humans carry multiple identities, race, gender, class, religion, sexuality, and they interact in ways that creates a really specific, nuanced, layered experience of power and disadvantage. You just can't understand someone's experience of racism if you're treating their race as the only thing that matters about them. Another thing that came out of critical race theory is storytelling, which is the lived experiences and the narratives of people from marginalized communities. They are legitimate knowledge about how systems work. They're not just anecdotes, they are evidence. And the last key idea that came from last week's episode is the critique of colorblindness and meritocracy. So treating everyone identically in a world shaped by centuries of racial hierarchy does not produce equality. What it actually does is reproduce the existing inequalities with, a facade or veneer of fairness. So I hope this real rapid fire summary is just things to ground you with this corridor that we're going to get into today. And one thing that I really wanted to start off with was, well, what does critical race theory look like outside of America? Because, critical race theory came from a very specific place, which is American law schools based on American legal history. And, if you think about the history of America, it's a country that built its economy on the enslavement of African people. And then, after emancipation, spent another century constructing legal and social systems to maintain that racial hierarchy, even though there wasn't that explicit language of slavery. And so that is history specific to America. And that is very different to what is happening here in Aotearoa. It's not the same as the Indigenous disposition of tangata whenua here in Aotearoa. It's not the same as the, legacy of colonial racial classification in South Africa or caste in South Asia. All the experiences of our Pacifica community, navigating both Indigenous identity and migrant identity simultaneously. And so I think, the way when we think about critical race theory, there are some really core ideas that kind of relate. But also, if you don't think about how critical race theory fits to these specific contexts, you know what, in my opinion, you're going to miss things and miss really important things. But I think the core thing here is that racial inequality is structural. It is embedded in law and institutions. And that, so in that case, just because something is in law or is legal, that formal equality it's not enough. It's not sufficient on its own, right? And the experiences of those marginalized communities, they have that essential knowledge, and these ideas travel, and they travel because colonialism was a global project, right? The structures are built, the hierarchies, it's also built, the stories that these structures and hierarchies tell who gets to be fully human, they're everywhere. They just look different in different places. But it's that same seed that is the same. And so I really want to get specific about what critical race theory can look like, means, or looks like here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because it's just very interesting when you think about how it applies here in Aotearoa. So let's just start with some facts, which is the fact that Aotearoa is a settler colonial state, and it's not a political slur. I'm really not here to stir the pot. If we want to get really real about the lens in which we view this world and challenging that, then we need factual descriptions, baby. And that's what it's that. British settlers arrived, and then it's kind of hard to condense the history here, but British settlers arrived, and then we have Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, and then kind of since then, that has just been, if my maths is correct, 180 years of ignoring, violating, and contesting, the terms of Te Tiriti. And that has generated this profound inequity, which is, is just insane when you really think with it. And so the version that Māori signed, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the one that Rangatira actually signed, is a document that guaranteed tēnā rangatiratanga, and I know that translations will 100% never capture the essence of the word, but the closest thing is Māori sovereignty and self-determination, while giving the Crown kāwanatanga, the right to govern the settlers who came. So it did not cede sovereignty. And that's not, an interpretation. That's literally what Te Tiriti o Waitangi says. The English version is different, and just the difference in the two documents, I think, is just like one of the OG acts of colonial manipulation, and I think critical race theory is just another way or another lens for understanding what really happened next, right? There was the formal legal equality of citizenship that was extended to Māori. But if you think about the structural arrangements of power, like who owned land, who made law, whose languages recognized in courts, whose knowledge systems were valued in school, very much remained shaped by colonial interests. And, this exact, flavor of racism is what is really embedded in our institutions and our structures. But the thing about it is that it comes across as if it's neutral when it really isn't. And you can see the impacts of that inequality now, which is why when I say the word history, I kind of use it with a bit of hesitation there or for a lack of a better word, because it's history that we're kind of living in right now. It's like living history because we see it now. Māori are disproportionately represented in every negative social statistic, incarceration rates, child poverty, preventable health conditions, homelessness, unemployment. But it's so weird because, how I was saying, when it comes to these types of conversations, multiple things can be true at the same time. But simultaneously, tangata whenua are deeply present in, I suppose, Aotearoa's quote-unquote cultural identity, right? The haka performed at sporting events, the reo Māori taught in schools, the treaty principles referenced in our laws. And I think there's this tension here between cultural celebration kind of coexisting with the structural disadvantage. And there's some language from critical race theory that can help us name what this tension is called exactly, and it's symbolic inclusion with structural exclusion. We'll put your culture on the rugby field, but we won't honour the political commitments that would transform your material conditions. And I think it would be amiss to bring up Te Tiriti without talking about Moana Jackson, because his work is essential. And, even though we lost someone with a lot of mana, we lost him in 2022, the way, Moana's mahi deserves to live in the conversations like this one. So Moana Jackson, a constitutional lawyer, a scholar, an activist, and just truly profound thinker when it comes to, really highlighting that relationship between law, colonization, and Māori sovereignty. And he was also a convener of the Mātiki Mai Aotearoa, which was an independent working group on constitutional transformation. And so Moana Jackson, along with Professor Margaret Mutu, they facilitated 252 hui across Aotearoa, and every single one of which Moana Jackson attended himself. And so they consulted so many people, over 10,000 people, iwi, hapu, Māori disability organisations, Māori LGBTQIA plus groups, gangs, churches, rangatahi, and the whole aim or the goal was to ask Māori communities, well, what does a constitution based on tikanga, on he whakapūtanga, and I haven't gotten too much into that in this episode, but the Declaration of Independence, and that in itself is really worthy Googling or reading about if you haven't heard of it before, or, Aotearoa actually looks like what would genuine constitutional transformation mean. And so the report, the Mātiki Mai report, was published on Waitangi Day 2016. It was, and it still is, like a landmark document. It identified values for a constitution, tikanga, community, belonging, place, balance, conciliation. And it also proposed 6 constitutional models based on the concept of different but interdependent spheres. A rangatiratanga sphere, where Māori make decisions for Māori, a kāwanatanga sphere, where the Crown governs its own people, and a space where they make decisions together, by agreement, and not just a simple agreement, a really deep, genuine agreement, really grounded in these values. And so the vision that this report painted was really like a constitutional transformation, not just, tinkering or thinking. It's truly a transformation. And I think, what Moana Jackson thought and said in his work, I think it really ties in quite well with critical race theory. And Moana Jackson said something very specific about colonization, that it has always been a many-rendered thing. It doesn't just take land. It takes stories. It takes language. It takes the very framework through which people understand themselves and their relationship to law and governance. And, one of the core ideas in critical race theory is kind of talking about this gap between formal equality and lived inequality. And Moana Jackson, kind of took this idea even further and said, the concept of formal equality within a system built by colonizers on colonized land, according to colonizers' legal frameworks, is itself a form of violence. You cannot achieve justice by reforming a system that was designed to produce injustice. You just have to imagine something different. And also, just to borrow more words from Moana Jackson, because they truly were just amazing, is that, colonization told a story about what Aotearoa was and who it belonged and who belonged in it. Decolonization is in part the work of telling different stories, older stories, truer stories, stories that restore the dignity and authority of those who were here before the ships arrived. And that is also another key idea from critical race theory, this idea of, counter storytelling, where the story of communities marginalized communities are told and seen and heard in a way where it's not just an anecdote but an evidence. So can you imagine this level of counter storytelling at a constitutional level? So I think when you kind of put Moana Jackson's words together with critical race theory, there's this really important question that comes up, which is not just like, how do we make the current system fairer, but what if this system is the wrong frame entirely? And just like really getting even deeper into how critical race theory, like what it looks like here in Aotearoa. I think everyone's got a copy or has bought or read this book, Imagining Colonization, which is written by Moana Jackson and Bianca Elkington, Rebecca Kettle, Ocean, Rebecca Mercier, and others as well. It's an amazing book. And I think it does something, it kind of builds upon critical race theory, which is, what it might look like to build something genuinely different. And it's kind of one of the critiques that people have towards critical race theory, is that it's better at diagnosis than prescription, to keep it quite clinical. Critical race theory is really good at identifying how racial inequality is kind of embedded in our systems and reproduced, but it's not really the best at kind of thinking about, well, what does justice look like in practice? And I think that book, Imagining Decolonization, tries to go there, tries to, make the imagination of a different constitutional and social reality concrete. What would Aotearoa look like if it genuinely honoured te tiriti, and not just in law, not just that formal equality, but like in daily life and education and land relationships and how decisions get made. And, I think this is really important to talk about, because we're, currently our government is actively rolling back on treaty commitments. And so, if you look at it from a critical race theory point of view, progress is made because it kind of converged with certain political interests. And so when those interests shifted, that rollback came, and I feel like we're really experiencing that rollback. And the fact that we are experiencing a rollback, it's kind of evidence in itself that the current system was never designed to honour te tiriti. And so the deeper work here is constitutional transformation, right? So I think that's really, really important. And while we're talking about, critical race theory here in Aotearoa, it would be wrong of me to not name Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's mahi here as well, because it really does run alongside critical race theory in a way that I think is really, really important. So her 1999, oh my gosh, even saying that year aloud sounds like I'm bringing out ancient receipts. But anyways, her 1999 book, Decolonizing Methodologies, is like, it's a landmark text. Okay, it's serious academic work about how research itself has been a tool of colonial violence, and how Indigenous communities can reclaim research as a tool for their own liberation. And Linda Tuhiwai-Smith makes this argument, and it directly connects to critical race theory's point about counter storytelling, is that the research methods Western academia uses to study Indigenous communities, have historically been extractive, reductive, and harmful. So researchers came in, took knowledge, classified communities, and produced findings that were often used to justify disposition or, quite paternalistic policy, in my opinion, and kind of left without any accountability to the communities that they studied. And so that way of doing research is very steeped in power. But kaupapa Māori research says, well, what if research was done by Māori for Māori according to Māori values and ways? What if the knowledge systems that count aren't just Western academic frameworks? And this is exactly the whole point of counter storytelling. It's saying, but I think it takes it a step further, right? Because counter storytelling is saying, include our stories in your framework. But this way of doing research is saying our frameworks are valid in their own right. And it's kind of, again, that distinction between reform and transformation. And I think that here in Aotearoa, we should really sit with that. So yes, critical race theory has its limitations, but also it's not just an American thing, and it does very much apply here in Aotearoa. And I think it's something that we need to get comfortable sitting with, because if you think about the concept of race, or just conversations that are very racialized, you see that more in America, but this kōrero is really relevant here to Aotearoa, but we need to apply it in a way that makes sense to what's happening here in our own backyard. So yeah, I just really wanted to, sink my teeth into that. Another thing that I really want to sink our teeth into when it comes to critical race theory is that, outside of the theory, how does it play out in our day-to-day, in our entertainment, in our music, and our phone? Because, here's the thing. Everything that we have discussed in this episode so far and the last, I get it. It's academic as heck. And it doesn't just live in academic texts or constitutional conventions, but these ideas, they also are very much alive in what we watch, what we listen to, what we find funny, what we find beautiful, what we find desirable. And I think culture is where ideology does its most invisible but also most powerful work, right? Because it's where the stories about who matters, who's dangerous, who's desirable, who's worthy, those are where these stories get told and retold and told in a different form and absorbed. And often this is happening without our conscious awareness. And you know what? I know you already hear the name coming, because I feel like I always talk about bell hooks, but bell hooks really understood this better than almost anyone. In her book, Real, R-E-E-L, okay, Real to Real, R-E-A-L, Race, Sex, and Class at the Movies, and also in so many of her essays on popular culture throughout the 90s and the 2000s. She made a really key argument that films and television are not just entertainment. They are teaching us constantly and relentlessly who to see as human, who to fear, what kinds of bodies and stories are worth censoring. And you know what? She had a term for this. She called this the function of the oppositional gaze, the act of watching critically, of refusing to accept the film's invitation to identify with his assumptions about who matters. And so, let's take this from theory to example, like any good teacher does in class. But I do want to preface this and put a little disclaimer out there that, this is nuanced territory. Just, acknowledging the structural dimensions of pop culture doesn't mean, every individual piece of art is simply propaganda or there's nothing worth celebrating. So, what I'm trying to say here is that the goal is not purity, it is clarity, okay? And I think a really good example to really talk about is Black Panther, because it's kind of perfect and complicated at the same time. So the year is 2018. I am just a young wee thing. I was in my 20s in 2018. Life was good. Okay, the haze, the vibes of 2016, that was still lingering around in 2018. Okay, it was a great year. And then it got even greater when Black Panther came out. And me, as a Black person, I was instantly like, I will give you my money to watch this film as much as possible. And it was just so refreshing to see Black people, I don't know, just living their best lives, being fully human, being smart and funny and sexy and wealthy and all these things that we just never really see about black people in movies. And you know what? And a lot of y'all out there really thought so too, because it was a $200 million Hollywood blockbuster, almost entirely black cast. You know, a vision of an African nation that was technologically advanced, never colonized. It was a story of black excellence, black royalty, black genius. And it was insane. Like, I just remember going on the internet at that time, and like you would see people wearing like traditional African dress to the cinemas. You know, little kids were having birthday parties in Wakanda. It just felt like something mattered with the Black Panther, and I suppose what you could call that is representation, right? Just even for myself, like seeing yourself reflected in stories, it's not just a small thing. And I know research can back this up, but even just anecdotally, like media representation, it really does shape how you see yourself, but also it also shapes how people outside of that group see them. And I think the thing about critical race theory is that it makes us ask the question, question mark, because if we kind of look at Black Panther through a critical race theory lens, it kind of pushes us to ask the question, like, what kind of representation and who's in whose service. So University of Alabama professor Kristen Warner, who is a critical race theorist, who studies Hollywood, sounds like my kind of person. I love it when someone, you know, I suppose Hollywood, okay, fluffy, whatever, but it's like when you can get deep with it, there's always something so real about the world that it says. But anyways, said something really important about Black Panther, and it did, you know, it kind of, she cop heat for it, but it's worth sitting with. You know, the fact that a film is culturally significant to communities of color doesn't mean it constitutes structural progress. And if you think about it, if we really get real about it, Black Panther, Marvel property, operating within the Disney corporate machine, designed to reach a global audience and generate maximum profit. You know, it was a spectacular and joyful and culturally resonant piece of art. But at the same time, it was also a commercial product, okay, made by a corporation that has to answer to shareholders and has to produce money. And so I think the question that critical race theory asks is not, was this representation meaningful? Because of course it was. And like, to this day, I still yearn for something that just gave me what Black Panther in 2018 did. But I think what critical race theory asks is, does meaningful representation within the existing system constitute transformation of the system? And I think the answer, you know, is a lot more complicated. Unfortunately, I don't have a easy, cohesive answer that I can tie with a ribbon on top for y'all. But if you think about it, you know, we've had movies like Black Panther and Crazy Rich Asians and Everything Everywhere All at Once. Wait, I hope I remembered that correctly. But if you know, so we've had these films like this, of that caliber and of that kind of representation, wholesome vibes. But UCLA's Hollywood diversity reports show that behind the camera representation, and I'm talking directors, producers, executives, writers' room, they remain unequal. It's just their faces on the screen that have diversified. So the structures of, you know, who controls the stories, who gets the deals, who gets to greenlight projects, they are still well behind. And so it's kind of that thing, that tension that critical race theory identifies, which is a formal equality versus the like informal lived experience equality. It still is very much happening. And I think there's also like a subtler thing happening here too, because, you know, critical race theory, one of the key tenets here is counter storytelling. So, you know, when a black superhero film or an Asian romantic comedy becomes the film that represents us, it's like this huge burden placed on that one story. It has to do way too much, right? It has to, you know, doesn't have the privilege of just being a particular story. It has to represent everyone. And it just can't, and it doesn't. You know, one of the critiques of Crazy Rich Asians is that it didn't represent working class Asian communities, or Asian men's experience in Hollywood. But, you know, I think that pressure is just a response to scarcity. You know, like when there are very few stories featuring Asian characters, every single one of them kind of have to bear the weight of, is this representative? When there's abundance of stories featuring white characters those characters in films do not have to carry that burden. You know, if we're keeping it really real, a mediocre film about a white family is just a mediocre film. It's not commentary on all whiteness. So I think the question that critical race theory really pushes us to ask when it comes to representation is, you know, why there's so few and who controls or whether there are more. I think another way that we can break down critical race theory is when it comes to music, because it's something that most of us enjoy, listen to, get down to. And I think there's a history here of black musical innovation kind of being extracted and repackaged and sold by white artists and white-owned labels to white audiences where, you know, while the originators are excluded from that wealth and that institutional power that their creativity generated. You know, if we think about blues, jazz, rock and roll, hip hop, R&B, house, techno, genre after genre that has emerged from black cultural creativity. You know, in many cases, the OG artists recorded for labels that own their masters, you know, received minimal royalties, and have no control over how their music was distributed or who received credit. And I think, critical race theory has this interesting lens here, which is, you know, black musical culture was celebrated and adopted by dominant white culture when it is convenient, right? When it's entertaining, when it's profitable, you know, without the structural conditions that would have allowed black artists to control that culture and the wealth it generated. And so now, and this is very much relevant in 2026 because we live in an algorithmic streaming world, right? Algorithms determine what gets surfaced, what gets heard, what accumulates listens. And, you know, as we kind of spoke about in the last episode, algorithms, like AI algorithms, they carry bias, right? They learn from existing patterns in a world that is racially unequal. And so music by black artists may get categorized in ways that limit promotion. But music that kind of sounds mainstream, or, you know, music that sounds like what white executives and white audiences have historically preferred gets promoted differently. And, you know, I'm not talking about some conspiracy, you know, it's structure doing what structure does. And you know what? This also kind of shows up in our dating preferences as well, if we're talking about our personal realm, you know. OkCupid, you know, one of the largest dating apps, published data from millions of user interactions between 2009 and 2014. And the findings, I mean, they were loud. Let me say that. Black women received the lowest reply rates of any group on the platform. Asian men received the lowest reply rates among men. White men received the highest reply rates from women across all racial groups. Asian women received the highest rates from men. But in a way that, and it's not anecdotally, the research is backing this up as well, that links that, interest to oh my God, why can I not say that word? Fetishization, rather than I genuinely really like you. Another study of 2.4 million heterosexual interactions on a Facebook dating application found pretty much the same kind of patterns. And there's more research that was published in 2024 that researchers found that white presenting profiles received significantly more interest than profiles presenting as people of color. So I think kind of what the key takeaway here is that, we cannot deny the influence of race when it comes to dating preferences. And there was another research that kind of broke down people's values and compared it with their dating behavior. And I think what was, the one thing that I could say from that research is that your fingers are more honest than your mouth. Okay? And I think another research that's kind of worth sitting with the results is that when users received an unexpected cross-racial message, when someone outside of your race kind of reached out to you and it was unexpected, then people would become more significantly likely to do so themselves in future interactions. And I think one positive interaction can change your behavior. So what that says to me, and maybe I could be reading in between the lines too much, is that these preferences they're not hardwired, they're habits, and then they can change. So, where do these preferences come from? And I think this is a great question that critical race theory can be applied to, because the question here is not, is this preference wrong? And I think if you pose this question to me, say, 10 years ago, I would have said, yes, yes, it is wrong, because it is wrong to fetishize people or to stray away from people because they're not seen as desirable in our society's eyes. But I think that's just a very narrow way of thinking about things. But I forgive myself for the passion that I had back then. But I think the question that critical race theory asks of us is, where does it come from and what shaped it? And sociologist April Williams, made the argument that patterns in dating app data directly reflect what Homegirl calls anti-Black and anti-Asian sentiments. And they have really been cultivated and promoted by media, cultural messaging, and historical de-evaluation. There's been centuries of representing Black women as undesirable, aggressive, unfeminine. There's also decades of Hollywood representing Asian men as asexual, passive, comedic, never the romantic lead, never the kind of masculinity Western audiences are trained to find desirable. And even these representations, they did not just come out of nowhere, They were produced by very specific industries and very specific historical moments, serving specific ideological purposes. The desexualization of Asian men and the over-sexualization of Asian women, really served those narratives about Asian passivity and availability, and the desexualization of Black women served narratives about Black femininity as outside the bounds of the idealized white womanhood that colonial culture worshipped. So, when people say, I just have a type, more often than not, we're describing the outcomes of a lifetime of cultural programming, images, stories, representations that we have absorbed before, we're even old enough to interrogate them. And, I'm not really coming out here for people's necks when I say this. It's not an accusation. It's just a mere observation about how culture works. And it kind of is a no-brainer because we are all shaped by the water that we swim in. I think the thing about critical race theory is that it puts us in a position where we then have to acknowledge, that water was designed, we can get out of the pool and come to our own conclusions and come to our own preferences. So I'm not out here as this gatekeeping dating demon telling you that you can't have preferences. I mean, we all have attractions. We all have preferences. Ain't nothing wrong with that. I think, if there's a certain pattern emerging, or it would just be silly to not acknowledge that, these preferences have the potential to be political. And we just have to be really real about that. Really real about that. What I kind of want to finish this episode talking about is colorism. And it's kind of like this hierarchy within, because while we're talking about race, it would be amiss to not talk about colorism. It's often something that gets left out of conversations about race, especially if we're talking about beauty and desirability and preferences. So it's not just, racism between racial groups, but the hierarchies of skin tone within, communities of color, aka colorism, and that's the preference for lighter skin within Black, Brown, South Asian, East Asian, Pacifica communities. And I think colorism is a direct inheritance of colonialism. That just the fact that you have lighter skin, it's proximity to whiteness, right? And that proximity to whiteness has, that power and beauty and status, which is actively cultivated by colonial systems. One industry that has very much benefited from colorism, the bleaching cream industry, which is worth billions globally. It is something that is present in my community, in my culture. I never used it growing up, and neither did my mother. Oh my God, my mother. And I'm really glad that, my mum she is just a strong ass woman. Like, the conclusions, well, you could say whatever you want, but the conclusions that she has about the world, they very much come from her. She's just not falling for the trappings of colorism, among many other things, but she's not falling for the trapping of colorism. So growing up, she very much was like, love yourself, appreciate your skin tone for what it is. And she made, like, my siblings and I, she didn't make us feel any type of way about our skin tone. I mean, I have 8 siblings, and between all 8 of us, we do have a varying shades of brown. Some of us are lighter, some of us are darker, but she never made it a big deal. I mean, if the ones who did have a lighter skin tone, she did not make us feel like we were extra special because of it. She never rewarded it, even though people outside of the family often would. If we were darker, she would always champion us and celebrate us just as much as all the other kids. Like, it was, she was so amazing for that, and I'm really grateful that she was like that and didn't give us a complex about our skin, because there are so many people that I knew in my community who would use those bleaching creams, and it's low-key terrifying, because I cannot even emphasize to you they really are bleaching creams that bleach your skin. I shudder to even think about, like, the health and safety of using those creams. But it didn't even matter what the consequences were, because the hierarchy that colorism established was just so strong. People would do anything to kind of literally become lighter, and have that proximity to whiteness. And I don't know, it's painful. And again, to quote Bell Hooks also wrote about colorism. It is one of the ways that oppression gets internalized, becomes part of the oppressed community's own value system. And it's something, the lighter skin you are, it is something that is so valuable. You are seen as more beautiful, you have more status, you have more power, and it's power and status and beauty that can be cashed in. Do you know what I mean? Like, if I was really to run with this metaphor, it's not like it's not a currency that is not valuable and not recognized within your own community. It very much is recognized within your own community. And that currency, it carries a lot of weight, it carries a lot of value. And it's insane, because when you think about colorism, it's like absorbing beauty standards to the point that among our communities, we are ranking each other according to proximity to those standards. So it's not just an individual prejudice at that point. It's a structural racism, kind of low-key at its most intimate and most devastating. And so intersectionality is also really important here too, right? Colorism operates differently within gender. Darker skin, Black women face the greatest disadvantage in hiring, dating, and social status, even within Black communities. Darker skinned Black men face more severe treatment in the criminal justice system. And so, this intersection of skin tone, gender, and race kind of creates layered, nuanced disadvantages that neither gender lens alone or a race lens alone can capture. And you know what? I'm going to put a pause on this episode here, but I really hope this episode has helped you realize how critical race theory is relevant and can be applied to our lives, and it's not just this theoretical thing. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns, and catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.